Welcome back to New Money. We're discussing estate planning this evening. My guests, Harry Joffe, Terry Berkovich. You'd like to email me, you'll get my details on the screen. Harry, because the estates take so long, and sometimes, particularly at the moment, if you think about an estate that's heavy in property, it's very difficult to liquidate properties at reasonable prices, certainly in the Gauteng area, maybe in the Western Cape and Atlantic Seaboard, not a problem. But if you have estate duty has to be paid within a year.
Yep.
What happens if it isn't?
So then, of course, interest starts running, and the SARS can levy, I think, penalties as well, Terry, but definitely interest.
Absolutely.
So interest
Well,
starts
hang
running.
on, is it interest and penalties, Terry?
Interest. I haven't had a case where they did penalties, but definitely where they started charging interest if estate duty wasn't paid within the first year of the person dying. You must write to SARS. You can write to SARS. As long as you write to them to request an extension, then interest won't run. But if you don't write to request the required extension, they will start charging interest, and there's no way that you can get out of it. You can't argue with them.
And if you write to them, will they reply?
Yes.
They will.
As long as you have it on record that you've written to them for the extension and you've given them proper reasons on why it can't be paid. Yeah.
Harry, talk to me about liquidity.
Yeah, I mean, so it's so important.
So
Once again, Bryan.
Here you've got properties in a state, 10, 15 million rands worth of properties. You've got children are inheriting 20% after the rebate of 3.5 million or 7 million, depending whether it's one or two spouses.
Correct.
Now you've got to find 1 million or 2 million.
Yep, so that what the estate should do, and this is something we keep training our financial advisors to do, you should do what we call a liquidity analysis on the estate. So that's to see, is there enough cash in the estate for all the taxes and costs to be paid? Because, dying is an expensive business, as we always say. I always say to some of our clients, you better live a long time because you can't afford to die. You've got to pay, executors' fees, masters' fees, all the other taxes, CGT, estate duty, there's advertising in the government gazettes and all the papers. It's an expensive business. So, if there's no liquidity, the executor will just flog off assets just to create cash, and that's going to be, of course, prejudicial to the heirs. So there should be an insurance policy paying into the estate to cover all those liquidity needs. Very important as well, Bryan.
This is for people, firstly, who are insurable.
Yes.
And probably a bit younger. As people get into their 60s, 70s and 80s, life insurance becomes quite expensive, particularly with different premium patterns, age, next birthday, and escalations and all that.
Well, Bryan, if you're a vitality diamond like you are, even at age 70, you can get a decent insurance policy.
Thanks, Harry.
But I think the point which is more important to me, Bryan, if you've got a policy paying into the estate, the executor can quite legitimately charge fees on that policy because it's paid into the estate. What we do is we arrange with the executors, if there's an insurance policy paying into the estate, they don't charge their 4% on that because it's actually helping the executor. The fact that
let's just summarise 3.5% plus VAT, which comes to about
4.02%.
Yeah.
But the point is it's actually helping the executor to have a policy paying into the estate to make it easier to wind up. So the executor with us doesn't charge fees. That's not every case, but it just makes it a lot simpler.
Yeah. Right, let's get on to the other condition in a will, usufruct. Okay, I know the use of the fruit, you've got the tree, you've got the fruits, but often the situation giving a spouse usufruct does not allow, and you know how areas have changed, particularly in Gauteng. People have moved, I think about 40 years ago, Berea, Hillbrow, Yeovil, people have moved now more north, and everything's happening. So how do you word a usufruct which allows the surviving spouse under circumstances to actually sell the property, replace the property? If there's money that's coming out surplus, they can distribute that to the family, but if there's not, they've got to pay the difference. But how can you deal with that in the will?
You can use a usufruct. There's a difference, as you correctly said, between the owner and the user of the asset. So what happens is the user gets to use that property for the remainder of their life, but the ownership actually sits with other parties. The problem with the usufruct is that they need enough money to be able to upkeep the property. And what happens is I see a lot of fighting with the usufruct, the person who's using the usufruct and the owners, because they will say that they need this done to the property, also the upkeep, or they need it to be renovated, and that creates a lot of fighting. So I don't like usufructs because they're complex, and they cause a lot of fighting. So I would prefer to use a trust mechanism to handle that. I don't know if Harry agrees.
Agree 100%.
Usufructs are also very old-fashioned and outdated.
Is that so?
But if they are done, you can word them properly and put all your terms and conditions, but it's just a very outdated way of putting that sort of structure in place.
And Bryan, the thing with usufruct, it's not an act of parliament, it's Roman Dutch law. I found out a fascinating thing last week. In English law, they don't recognize usufructs. It's not part of English law. So, I mean, ours is Roman Dutch law, but it's common law. So if you want to actually decide who must pay the painting of this house under usufruct, you've got to go look at the old Roman Dutch authorities and a bit of case law, and it's not very clear. I mean, it's difficult.
Correct.
So a trust is much cleaner, much simpler. The tax is simpler. I mean, a usufruct is complicated for the estate duty calculation as well. Because remember, on the second dying, when the usufruct ceases, that creates an estate duty liability, which people often forget. There's a bare minimum value. It's just not worth going into a usufruct. It is old-fashioned, it's backward. Trusts are much simpler and cleaner.
You must come across wills all the time with usufructs.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And they're very complex and they create a lot of fighting, and you've got to register them at the deeds office if it's an immovable property. So current wills that I draft, I never include a usufruct. I rather say, please make provision for that person separately. Get them their own little townhouse. Don't give right of use to assets. And if you do want to do it that way, then use a trust, because the trust sets out clearer terms and creates less fighting.
You see, guys, you learn all the time, because this morning I wrote you a letter, Terry, on a will, and I suggested usufruct. And I said, your comments.
You just got
Have
them,
my
Bryan.
comments, yeah.
Then, Harry, what makes a will? What is the most common reason a will becomes invalid?
So, Bryan, I mean, our Wills Act is very old-fashioned, very formal, has to be signed in a certain way, so it has to have a wet ink signature at the bottom of the page. Me and Terry will both remember from law school our case where the client signed in the middle of the page, and the court said it's invalid. You've got to sign at the bottom of the page in wet ink. You need to have two witnesses signing also at the bottom of the page in the presence of the testator and of each other. And we've had a lot of court cases where they haven't signed in the presence of the testator and that will's invalid. Then, of course, those two witnesses, to be able to benefit, can't benefit from the will. So if they're a witness and they're benefiting from the will, they're disqualified as heirs. So they can't be a beneficiary of the will. And then, of course, there's a big problem, which we're having a lot more now. Does the testator have capacity to sign this will? Do they understand what they're doing? So, we have a lot of elderly clients, and they're signing a will, and then there's a question whether they're unduly influenced, were they pushed into doing certain things. There's court cases all the time where the one kid gets cut out because he had a fight with dad, and now he comes to court and says the other kids ganged up against him and got dad to cut him out the will. There's a lot of these issues, especially with our aging population now.
So let me ask you on that one, because I've got a few clients who have excluded one kid. Is that automatically going to be a fight?
Well, if the kid is not told about it and there's no good reason, the kid could very easily fight it. And they can bring an undue influence case, or dad didn't have capacity. There's a case now in Australia. Sorry, I've got to get this out, Bryan. 57-year-old kid took their dad's estate to court and claimed maintenance from the dad's estate. 57-year-old kid. I mean, they lost, but it cost over $70,000 in fees for their estate, and it took another year to wind up. And that's what happened, Bryan.
Terry, what about, so I'm saying, have you ever had a situation where one kid's been left out and it's actually fought and won?
I have never had a case like that, but when you look at the contesting of a will, it's a very difficult case to prove. As Harry said, they'll lose. They can delay the matter and cost the estate a lot of money, but they can't just do it out of spite. There has to be a valid reason, and they have to prove that the person was unduly influenced, or that they did not lack the mental capacity to draw the will, or that it didn't adhere to the signing formalities. But as Harry was saying, the requirements for the validity of a will are so strict that the attorneys that will pick up on certain technicalities that could actually declare the will invalid. I remember there was one case that I did in law school where if it was the date was that 15 centimeter rule, that if it's not signed, the dating and signing, if it's signed too far at the bottom of the page, that would be an invalid will.
Because you've got all that blank.
Correct.
And I've seen wills like that, where they sign at the bottom of the page, but they finish halfway up.
And Bryan, there's always an issue, did the witnesses sign in the presence of the testator? Because we know what happens, the testator signs and sends it to his friend to be a witness afterwards, and another witness. And if that ends up in court, the court could rule that invalid.
And people must also remember that the witnesses are must not be firstly beneficiaries of the will, but not only beneficiaries, the executor and any trustee appointed in the will and their spouses must not sign as witnesses. Very important that they're independent.
Well, Harry and I always know we run out of this program, so we've got 18 emails to get through in the next 3 minutes. Terry, this is from Jeanette in Birdhaven.
Yes.
My husband passed away recently. Unfortunately, we had struggled financially for many years, leaving him with no asset in his name. However, I'm the beneficiary of a life insurance policy, and his will, which is more than 1 million, I understand that his estate still needs to be wound up. My concern is, who will handle this process if there are no funds in the estate to cover the costs?
So you can go to an attorney, because executive fees are only due at the end of the estate. So what will happen is they can run with the estate.
So
and
the
then,
first it has to be wound up.
Has to be wound up. They have to get the letters of. Now the insurance companies, we had a matter, the life annuity matter, where they want the letters of executorship. Normally, it's not just paid out to the heirs. They want the letters of executorship or the letter of authority, normally the letter of executorship. So it has to have the whole process. You can go to an attorney and say, I am getting this money, but the problem is that the money will only be available at the end of the matter, which is why Harry recommends those products that inject the estate with liquidity so that you can take on the matter.
And Harry, I know you always like the last words. I'm going to put this one from Rose.
Thank you,
She says,
Bryan.
when is an offshore will necessary? My husband and I have equity investments abroad. Can our South African will cover these assets, or do we need a separate will for them?
So, Bryan, that's a very tricky question, and it's very long and involved. I mean, it depends in which jurisdiction those assets sit. Let's say equity. Is it a unit trust? Is it an endowment? Is it a share portfolio? What are the actual assets? Because it all depends. If it's a simple unit trust with a South African insurance company, that can be included in the South African will. If it's a share portfolio through one of the American banks or one of the Swiss banks in Switzerland, you might well need a separate Swiss will. It depends on the circumstances, depends on the facts of the case. If it's fixed property, then you always need a separate will, because fixed property falls under the law of that foreign jurisdiction where it is, and you don't want your South African will, with a usufruct being sent to the UK where they don't recognise a usufruct to handle that property. So I think you need more specialist advice. We need a lot more facts on that case.
Well, Harry, this is our last program of the year with you and I, so we'll carry that forward into January. But South Africans need to recognise that for many years it was possible to circumvent certain trust requirements. However, since the grey listing rules were lifted, regulations have been significantly tightened. I strongly recommend that anyone with a trust review their past actions to ensure that going forward they fully comply with all trust regulations. Next week's program we'll be dealing with investments. I'd like to thank you for watching, and Terry and Harry, thank you for joining me this evening. All the best.
Thank you so
Bryan.
much. Thank you, Bryan.